This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Uplight. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series about the demand stack concept, my guest is Audrey Zibelman, former New York Public Service Commission chair and former CEO of Australia's energy market operator. Audrey is going to give us her perspective on the demand stack concept. It was proposed by energy management and demand flexibility provider Uplight, and it's an approach to customer-owned distributed energy resources that can maximize their benefits to utilities, customers, and the power system. Audrey's career in energy has included, in addition to chairing the New York Commission and heading Australia's power system, time as general counsel to the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission, as an executive with Xcel Energy, the PJM Interconnection, and X's Moonshot, and as president and CEO of Aridity Energy. She's currently board chair of Landis & Gyr and non-executive director of Wind and Storage Developer Squadron and of the Emirates Water and Electric Company, or EWEC. So Audrey, give us your perspective. You've got a very wide range of career experiences that could really contribute to us understanding the value of Uplight's concept of the demand stack. Begin, if you would, with what exactly is a utility or a system operator's supply stack? That's a traditional concept. How could utility demand-side programs that make up a comparable demand stack be used like the supply stack is in planning and operations?
Hi, Herman, and great to be here. So, look, I think that the recognition is that across various systems, every system in the world, there are certain things that you have to do to keep the lights on. The first thing you have to do is make sure that there's enough supply to meet instantaneous demand. And we think about that in terms of, we talk about reliability payments, capacity payments. All of these are around making sure there's an adequate amount of electricity being produced as is needed to meet the instantaneous demand. But that's not enough to keep the lights on. We also have to keep the grid stable, is the way we talk about in Australia. But these tend to be reliability requirements, like making sure that frequency stays within a certain bandwidth, making sure there's sufficient reactive power, which is a very technical aspect of the grid, making sure that there's enough response in a very short period of time. We call it ramping services, so that the grid itself remains stable as well as adequate of supply. And in the markets, we pay generators to supply these different resources. When there's a lot of renewables, one of the things that we learned is we have to have enough inertia in the system. And these are all types of services that in US vernacular are often called ancillary services, but they're really not ancillary in the sense of extra. They're actually essential services around grid stability. When we think about it then on the demand side, typically the way we've always thought about it is that if there is not adequate supply and we have customers who are able to drop their load from the grid because they have local generation or they don't need it, that's a payment we could make them because it's cheaper than building just enough generation for these minutes of the year where that might happen. And that's traditionally been the thought of demand response, is to getting rid, not needing additional supply or these peak shaving resources. But at the same time, demand resources can be providing other services. They could provide ramping services. They can provide reactive services. They could provide system stability, voltage management services. And the question around a demand stack is saying, well, we know that a lot of these things can be provided locally, just as they could be provided on the grid. Shouldn't we be paying demand providers for this capability? And increasingly even the question of flexibility, the ability to shift over hours. And so a demand stack concept would be to say, rather than thinking about this as simply the hammer to the nail, is demand like a generator can be a bit of a screwdriver. It can provide a lot of different resources, and we ought to be sending the strong economic signals so that people can optimize how we use it, and that therefore optimize the grid itself.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way you described it. It is rare on the podcast that people can bring so much understanding of the complexities. You think, oh, all I have to do in my home is flip the switch and the lights come on. But the sum total of everybody who's flipping their switch on, flipping their switch off, causes a lot of complexity for the people that actually have to run the grid, right?
That plus when you think about supply is always moving. It's a dynamic system. And
And
things are continuously moving at the speed of light.
and so the utilities and system operators, for a long time, maybe since the beginning, of the electric system, they are aware of what the stack of supply is that they have. The supply, it may be a coal, long ago, it might have been a coal plant. More recently, it might have been a nuclear plant. But um, they look in planning their systems, they know what's in their supply stack, so that when they get to operating the system, they figure out, well, what was planned for that we can deal with if we need some of those ancillary services. And maybe we could see demand side resources getting into those processes, planning and operations. Am I saying that right? Does that sound plausible to you? Does that sound like something that would enhance the value of the power system?
Well, I think that if you had this value stacking, and it's something actually we did in New York, we called it the value of distributed energy resources, was to make
Okay.
sure that you were creating those, articulating the economic value of different capabilities. What happens is it drives a much more efficient system. I mean, you're absolutely right. We built the grid in the last century around synchronized generation, which offered some of these services automatically, such as inertia that you need to keep the grid stable. And now that we're moving to a much different type of environment, including the use of renewables that are electronics as opposed to synchronized, the system is becoming I would say not more complex, but just much more granular that you have to operate. And I guess that would add complexity. But what it also does is it provides an advantage to be able to be much more specific about what you need at what spot. And I think that where demand can come in is that not only can you provide the services such as keeping the grid reliable, but at a local distribution level, you can provide services that the distribution utility might need that the transmission system doesn't need. So yes, power system operators have always known that it's necessary to have these capabilities. Historically, their only resource for providing these capabilities were large generators. Now, as the system is becoming more sophisticated, we're seeing other tools, even like asynchronous generators that can be used without providing power to keep the grid stable. Operators have more arrows in their quiver, if you will, and some of these arrows now exist on the demand side, and using them will be more economically efficient. What we have to do is create the market environment so that it's easy to provide them, just as it used to be easy for generators to provide the services they can do.
Oh, Uplight says, I want to look at those arrows in the quiver a little bit more carefully. Uplight says that the demand stack would have uh, behavioral, rates-based, and device-driven demand side programs. Things like energy efficiency, that's a demand side program. Demand response, you mentioned that earlier, it's a demand side program. And time varying rates affects the demand that comes from customers, and all of those kinds of things involve in one way or another distributed energy resources and sometimes VPPs, virtual power plants. And what I want to ask you, Audrey, is do you think that seeing all of this, these types of resources, all of these arrows in the quiver, could motivate utilities to create those values for those programs, to see the value in this whole set of resources?
I think what's happening, and the market is really at its nascent levels,
Hmm.
is that utilities can see the value of being able to get things from grid edge resources to allow the grid to remain both stable, reliable, and much more cost effective. The question is what's the economic transaction look like?
Hmm.
And there are, I think, a number of people who believe that the best way to motivate consumers to provide these types of services is to send them a price signal to set the value. Others believe that consumers can be simply motivated by saying you can reduce their bill if they would to participate in these programs, and that from a consumer perspective, knowing that they're getting electricity at a reduced price because their ability to participate in these types of programs would be enough because most consumers don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. So, but it amounts to the same thing, whether you're sending prices to devices like we do on the internet, or you're doing time varying pricing and people get credit. The point being is that if we can use demand as an active component on the grid, for example, if it's as simple as slowing down the charging of a vehicle because it helps make the grid more stable and avoids having to put in a new transformer, and people are saying, well, I don't care so long as my car is charged at 6 a.m. when I get up in the morning. That's the type of thing that the industry is moving towards, or a heat pump that can be variated, things that companies like Uplight can do that have no impact on the consumer, but provide a lot of value to the grid. How that shows up for a consumer could be in a time varying rate, or could be just a credit on their bill. That's what I think the industry is looking at. But from a utility perspective, it's having the confidence that if they send a signal and say, I need this to happen on the grid, and it happens, then it allows them to rely on it. What utilities can't do is guess and hope. They have to know because it is a system that they're running.
The grid is changing fast, with data centers, electrification, and extreme weather driving a surge in energy demand. Utilities can meet the moment with existing resources by activating energy customers and their connected devices with Uplight's integrated demand stack. Uplight coordinates energy efficiency, rates, demand response, and virtual power plant programs into one cohesive strategy to improve grid resiliency and energy affordability. Their AI-powered platform connects customers to best fit programs, then forecasts, dispatches, and measures flexible capacity to deliver megawatts when the grid needs it most. Learn how Uplight is helping leading utilities harness over 8 gigawatts of flexible load at uplight.com/USEA.
So I want to turn to another subject that and ask you how the demand stack would apply to it. We're hearing these days a whole lot about system utilization, and you mentioned earlier the idea of shifting usage, and again, you just mentioned it before in a sense because if you slow down charging of an electric vehicle, you're shifting where that demand falls in the system's activities. And people are talking all about system utilization because um, the system's basically underutilized a very large amount of the time, and then you get these peaks that drive up costs. So people are saying that if you improve system utilization, you can protect affordability because you don't drive up the costs. But you're not compromising reliability because you're still providing the service, you're just moving it. So I tried to begin to describe system utilization there, Audrey. Could you maybe add to that and tell us how it impacts affordability and reliability? And but the big question here, and for the subject of this podcast, is: do you think that understanding demand-side resources as a stack could improve system utilization?
Sure. So I thought of it, I think of an analogy that a lot of people who probably are aware of that today. So on one hand, system utilization in the traditional way would be the fact that we have to build the power system because it is a product that has to be delivered instantaneously to meet peak demand. And so when people modeled how much we need for generation and transmission and distribution, it presumes that everybody is using electricity all at once on the hottest day of the year. And that hottest day is usually, and that hottest period is just a few hours, but not everybody is going to use electricity all the time at the same time, but you have to plan for it because you can't just simply hope that that doesn't happen. That means for the rest of the year, you have a lot of capability in the system that's being underutilized. So one thing you want to do is say, well, hang on. If we have all this distributed generation that's being built in and people have backup generation, and they're willing to shift away and not either use their own resources or be able to turn off things that they don't need during these periods, and we can rely on that as a grid operator, that's as good as building a generator. And we should pay people for that because that's of value to us and it's usually cheaper and it avoids other types of costs. And so that's the traditional demand response sort of thought, which is I would rather pay my neighbor $2 and pay a generator $5 if that means my lights stay on. And so that's one idea, one piece of it. The other piece of it is very dynamic. And so we also need things to provide, like I say, this kind of ancillary support. But we also, at a very local level, you might have everyone charging up their car, and the distribution utility might say, hang on, I don't have enough. There's plenty of supply, but on this particular street, I can't have everyone charging their car up at the same time. So those are the types of flexibility support mechanisms we need. I liken it to this. If everybody, we know that there's a certain amount of people who are going to travel to Washington, D.C. every July 4th for the 4th of July. And if we bought enough hotels, built enough hotels to make everyone be able to stay in the district during that period of time, there'd be a lot of hotel rooms that sit empty a lot of the year. And so we look for alternatives such as building hotels in neighboring regions, and even Airbnb provides an important role in making sure that we could do that. And so that's the kind of demand system utilization that you'd want, because otherwise you'd have a lot of hotels that would probably go bankrupt because they'd be sitting there idle. At the same time, and what we've all learned in buildings, we used to operate elevators so that you push the floor number and the elevator gets called, but then everybody else comes in and they're pushing their floors and it takes you 20 minutes to get to your floor because this elevator is stopping at every floor. Now we have new systems. You come in, you just push in your number, and the elevators are continuously optimized. So you don't have one person getting out at one floor. They're directed to the elevator. The other piece that we're saying around system utilization is we'd rather have that system where it's more granular, more precise. We're not paying for a new generator just because we need it for this particular service. We can do something much more discrete. And what that means is that one is you don't have to build the system for peak. You can build it knowing that you have this level of demand response flexibility, and you can distribute the services so the system becomes more resilient and also safer to use because you have your resources much more distributed. And so the goal, therefore, of when we think about system utilization, it's not building things you don't need and then using what you have a lot more efficiently.
Exactly. And if you don't build things you don't need, then you don't have as much cost. And if you don't have as much cost, you're saving the need to increase rates. It's
That's right.
it's in some ways, it's really a sophisticated way of thinking about things, but in some ways it's very simple. I want to ask you one more question, Audrey, but I do want to take just a minute here to mention to our listeners, you mentioned July 4th in Washington, D.C. The podcast is going to have a very special set of July 4th 250th birthday of the United States podcast coming up right around the 4th. So check out our listings, and you'll be very pleased and surprised at what you're going to find out about on our podcast. But the last question, Audrey. When you headed Australia's power system, the integrated planning that the system does showed regulators there what the underutilized flexibility that was in the demand stack, Australia's demand stack, could offer. And as a result, there's an enormous increase in distributed resources in solar plus storage and other resources now in Australia. They're really way ahead of most of the countries in the world. What did that response to that information how did it impact the Australia's system operators? You were one of them. And could U.S. utilities and regional systems use that demand stack potential in the same way to address today's load growth and load uncertainty?
Well, yeah, yes and yes. So I think one of the things that, as a system operator, we were very aware of the fact that as solars began to be added to the grid, we'd have problems in the afternoon and that we wouldn't have enough demand. And then in the evening, when the sun was setting, because so much solar was coming off the system quickly, we had issues of keeping the system stable. And that consequently, we needed to think about the grid as not turn that into a problem, but think about the solutions. And so that's where we started to think about how we could use storage better to be able to basically use this afternoon sun to modulate what we needed on the system. And it continues to grow in Australia. I think the US grid operators can do the same thing. They could think about how to integrate distributed generation. To do that requires a different relationship than they have today with the distribution utilities. And one of the things that we talk about in Australia was a system operating envelope that the distribution utility had to keep the system in balance. I think in the US grid, it's a very technical piece, but we think about the grid as being a balancing area that the transmission operator is responsible for. What we could think about this as sort of more of a concentric circle that the distribution utility plays a bigger role in making sure that the demand is predictable and controllable by using distributed resources there. And then the transmission operator is looking at how to complement that with what's going on in generation. That requires a lot more, a better form of communication and also setting up the role. So I absolutely think it could be done and should be done in the US. What we need to do is, like in most things in regulation, say this is where the puck is going. This is where we're skating to. That's not an Australian analogy. We never talk about ice hockey in Australia, but that and then get there. And I think those are discussions that should be had because it will drive efficiency through the grid and also increase resiliency. And I would say that, in light of us talking about this in terms of this is a 250th year, we could think about this as, again, a form of energy democratization. And what DER does is it leads us into that direction.
And speaking of that direction, that's where the whole system is going. It's becoming a more software-based set of operations that can incorporate a lot more things than were traditionally incorporated. Is that correct?
That's correct. And, to put a plug into, as you note, I'm on the chair of Landis and Gear. That's why we're looking at advanced metering 2.0 as really thinking about the meter as the computer at the edge of the system. And it moves to a much more distributed network, which is, to me, is how we drive efficiency. That's certainly what we've learned in the internet and communication. The more we decentralize, the better we have a system that can operate well and at lower cost.
And to put a plug in, that management of all that software and data is what our sponsor Uplight, who proposed this data stack, the demand stack, that's what they do. Just real briefly, Audrey, this is a tangent, I think. all the way back in like 2016, 2018 period, when you were with the New York Commission, you actually worked on um, developing a distribution system operator, which then evolved into the utilities. And they have, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, just a few words about this. Haven't they performed some improvements in the use of energy efficiency through their ability to manage demand side activities as distribution system operators?
They have. So, and the objective in New York was in that time it was in a post-Sandy world and thinking about it in terms of resiliency, but also how to meet New York's climate goals economically efficiently, was to recognize that for this to happen, we needed to reform regulation as well. And the regulatory reform we needed to do was to give utilities the ability to say the more they can use distributed energy to meet the demands of their customer, and because it was cheaper than the alternative, their economic rewards would be either the same as if they built it themselves or even better. Because in our goal really for everything, and it's where systems thinking happens, it's not just the technology that matters, the markets, the pricing, the regulation all need to be aligned in the same way. And a little bit, as we talked about the work I've done with Pew, was to recognize that it's not a technical issue. We know that it works. We know economically it works. What we need to do is get markets and regulation working well so that companies like Uplight can easily deploy their resources for the benefit of consumers.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned it at the very end there, the systems thinking, because really that's what we're dealing with. In the past, this is my little editorial and we're going to close up, but in the past, we talked about the power system as a grid. I don't like that term because it sounds like something flat. What I like is the power system because it is a system that has so many dimensions that can be run so effectively by software and system thinking. And I'd like our listeners to be left with that thought as we close this out. Audrey, thank you so much for talking to me about this stuff. My guest has been Audrey Zibelman, former New York Commission chair, former Australian Energy Market CEO, and currently board chair of Landis & Gyr and non-executive director of Squadron and of EWEC. She's offered us some really terrific insights into how a utility's demand stack can protect affordability without compromising reliability and, in fact, supplementing reliability. I also want to thank our sponsor, Uplight, and my producer, Melissa Brown. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.